My name is Sophia Mitchell, and I'm 24 years old. 3 weeks ago, I collapsed during the most important presentation of my marketing career, blood pooling in my mouth as my heart seized like a broken engine. The emergency room doctors discovered severe mitral valve prolapse requiring immediate surgery, or I'd be dead within months. When I called my parents sobbing, begging them to help me navigate this nightmare, they delivered the crushing blow that shattered my world forever. We won't allow any artificial interference with God's plan for your body, Sophia. If He wants you healed, prayer will suffice. Then a mysterious billionaire stepped forward as my legal guardian, and I never could have imagined who he really was. Before we dive into this incredible journey that changed everything I thought I knew about family, love, and survival, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like button if you're ready for a story about finding hope in the darkest places. Don't forget to subscribe because this story proves that sometimes the people who choose to love us become more family than those who gave us life. Now, let me take you back to the beginning of the most terrifying and beautiful transformation of my existence. The cardiologist's words still echo in my mind like a death sentence wrapped in medical terminology. Miss Mitchell, your mitral valve is severely prolapsed, causing blood to flow backward into your left atrium. Without surgical intervention within the next 2 months, you'll experience complete heart failure. Dr. Elizabeth Harper spoke with the gentle precision of someone who delivered countless devastating diagnoses, but nothing could soften the reality that my 24-year-old heart was essentially broken beyond natural repair. The echocardiogram images on her computer screen showed the damaged valve fluttering like a wounded butterfly, unable to close properly and allowing my life force to leak away with every desperate beat. I sat in that sterile examination room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry wasps, trying to process how my active, healthy lifestyle had betrayed me. I'd been the girl who ran 5 miles every morning, who chose salads over burgers, who'd never even had a cavity until I turned 18. Yet here I was, staring at ultrasound images of my failing heart while Dr. Harper explained surgical procedures involving artificial valves, bypass machines, and recovery periods that could stretch for months. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent years avoiding my parents' suffocating religious community, only to need their support when my body decided to stage its own rebellion against life itself. The drive to my childhood home in Millbrook felt like traveling backward through time, each familiar landmark reminding me of the girl who'd escaped this small town's narrow expectations. My parents' white colonial house sat perfectly manicured behind its picket fence, the American flag hanging limp in the humid afternoon air, while Martha Mitchell's prized rose garden bloomed in defiant beauty. I found them in the living room where I'd spent countless Sunday afternoons listening to fire and brimstone sermons on the radio. My father Robert hunched over his worn leather Bible while my mother Martha mended clothes with the mechanical precision of someone who'd never questioned her role in life. When I explained my condition, showing them the medical reports and surgery recommendations, their response crushed me more completely than any physical collapse ever could. Robert Mitchell, the man who'd taught me to ride bicycles and check under my bed for monsters, looked at me with the cold certainty of someone who believed his daughter's death was preferable to challenging God's mysterious ways. Sophia, you've spent too many years in that godless city, filling your mind with secular medicine and worldly concerns. This illness is a test of faith, nothing more. His voice carried the same authoritative tone he used when leading prayer meetings, but now that authority was aimed like a weapon at my desperate heart. My mother's reaction was somehow worse than my father's religious absolutism. Martha Mitchell had once bandaged my scraped knees and stayed up all night when I had pneumonia as a child, but now she sat with her hands folded in submission, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she chose her husband's interpretation of divine will over her daughter's survival. Sweetheart, we've prayed about this situation, and the Lord has made His wishes clear. Modern medicine is mankind's attempt to interfere with His perfect plan. If you're meant to be healed, He will provide that healing through faith and prayer alone. The next 2 hours unfolded like a nightmare sequence where everything familiar became foreign and threatening. Robert produced pamphlets from their church about the evils of medical intervention, stories of people who'd supposedly been cured through prayer alone, and testimonials from families who'd chosen faith over surgery with miraculous results. When I tried to argue using logic and medical evidence, he dismissed my words as evidence of how thoroughly the secular world had corrupted my thinking. "You've been poisoned by worldly wisdom, Sophia. This heart condition is God's way of calling you back to righteousness." The final blow came when I asked about health insurance and financial support for the surgery, revealing the true depth of their conviction. Robert's face hardened into the expression he wore when casting out demons during particularly intense prayer sessions. "If you choose to mutilate the body God gave you with surgical knives and artificial devices, you'll do it without our blessing, our support, or our family name. We won't enable your rebellion against divine providence." Martha nodded through her tears, sealing my fate with her tearful compliance to patriarchal authority that valued ideology over maternal love. That evening, Dr. Harrison Webb knocked on my apartment door with Chinese takeout and the kind of gentle concern that made me realize how desperate I'd become for basic human compassion. Harrison had been my family's physician for over a decade, watching me grow from an awkward teenager into an independent woman, and he understood the religious dynamics that were literally threatening my life. Over lo mein noodles and spring rolls, he explained that my parents belonged to an increasingly radical faction within their church, one that viewed modern medicine as evidence of humanity's sinful pride and rejection of divine healing. "Sophia, I've seen this pattern before in fundamentalist communities," Harrison said, his voice heavy with professional frustration and personal sadness. "Families convince themselves that refusing medical treatment demonstrates superior faith, but they're essentially gambling with lives based on theological interpretations that most mainstream Christians would consider extreme. Your parents aren't evil people, but they've been influenced by teachings that prioritize ideological purity over practical compassion." His words provided context, but no comfort, because understanding their motivations didn't change the fact that my own parents had chosen religious dogma over their daughter's survival. The first attack on my independence came swiftly and comprehensively, demonstrating that my parents' rejection wasn't merely theological, but strategically calculated to force my compliance. Within 48 hours, I received notification that they'd removed me from their health insurance policy, canceled the car insurance they'd been helping me pay, and closed the joint savings account that contained my emergency funds. Robert had called my employer to inform them that their daughter was struggling with mental health issues and might need extended time off, effectively sabotaging my professional reputation while claiming concern for my well-being. My apartment became a fortress of medical bills, insurance paperwork, and mounting evidence that I was completely alone in this fight for survival. The surgery estimate exceeded $60,000, a sum that might as well have been $6 million given my marketing coordinator salary and newly destroyed credit standing. Every phone call to insurance companies ended with the same devastating news that my condition was considered pre-existing, my parents' policy cancellation had eliminated my coverage, and individual insurance would require waiting periods that exceeded my medical timeline. As my condition worsened, causing increasing fatigue and chest pain, the walls were closing in both financially and physically, leaving me trapped between my parents' religious extremism and medical bureaucracy's cold indifference. The hospital's social worker's office smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams, its beige walls decorated with motivational posters that felt mockingly optimistic given my circumstances. Linda Chin had the exhausted competence of someone who'd navigated countless medical crises, her desk cluttered with case files representing families torn apart by illness, poverty, and impossible choices. I'd been sitting in her cramped office for 20 minutes, explaining my situation while she typed notes into a computer system that seemed designed to catalog human suffering with bureaucratic efficiency. "Miss Mitchell, your case is unusual but not unprecedented," Linda said, leaning back in her squeaky office chair while reviewing my file. "We've handled similar situations where religious beliefs conflict with medical necessities, though rarely involving parents who actively sabotage their adult child's access to treatment. The good news is that several charitable organizations specialize in helping patients navigate exactly these circumstances. She handed me a stack of pamphlets about medical grants, payment programs, and religious mediation services, but her expression suggested she understood how inadequate these resources would be given my timeline and financial situation. Then she mentioned something that changed everything in ways I couldn't have imagined. There's also been an unusual development in your case. A private individual has contacted our administration about potentially serving as your legal guardian to facilitate medical decision-making and financial support. This is highly irregular, but not illegal if you consent and meet certain psychological evaluation requirements. Linda's tone carried professional caution mixed with genuine curiosity, as if she'd never encountered anything quite like this situation during her 15-year career. Gabriel Sterling entered Linda's office with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention without demanding it. He was perhaps 50 years old, with silver-touched dark hair and the kind of understated expensive clothing that suggested serious wealth without ostentation. His handshake was firm but gentle, his voice carried traces of an education that included prestigious universities, and his eyes held a depth of sadness that seemed oddly familiar despite our never having met. When Linda introduced him as the CEO of Sterling Technologies, I recognized the name from business magazines and technology headlines, but couldn't fathom why a billionaire would involve himself in the medical crisis of a complete stranger. "Miss Mitchell, I understand you're facing an impossible situation with very limited options and extremely limited time," Gabriel said, settling into the cramped office chair with the grace of someone who'd learned to adapt to any environment. "I'd like to propose a solution that might seem unconventional, but could save your life while allowing you to maintain your dignity and independence. I'm prepared to assume legal guardianship, cover all medical expenses, and provide whatever support you need during recovery and beyond." His offer sounded too good to be true, triggering every warning signal I developed during years of navigating a world where nothing valuable ever came without hidden costs. My immediate response was suspicion mixed with desperate hope, a combination that left me feeling emotionally whiplashed and intellectually confused. "Mr. Sterling, I appreciate your offer, but I need to understand why a successful businessman would want to help someone he's never met. What do you expect in return?" Gabriel's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes that suggested my question touched on painful territory. He explained that his motivation was deeply personal, though he wasn't ready to share details, and that his only expectation was my commitment to full recovery and eventual independence. The legal paperwork for emergency guardianship moved with surprising speed, facilitated by Gabriel's attorneys and the hospital's administration eager to resolve my case before it became a medical emergency. Within 72 hours, I found myself standing in a judge's chambers signing documents that transferred legal authority over my medical decisions from parents who'd abandoned me to a virtual stranger who'd appeared like some kind of secular guardian angel. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was replacing one form of paternalism with another, but at least this version came with health insurance and a genuine commitment to keeping me alive. Gabriel's penthouse apartment overlooked the city, like a glass and steel sanctuary suspended above the chaos of ordinary life. The space was elegantly furnished, but felt lived in rather than decorative, with personal touches that suggested someone who valued comfort over ostentation. A wall of floor-to-ceiling windows provided breathtaking views of the urban landscape where I'd been struggling to survive, while built-in bookcases held an eclectic collection that ranged from technology manuals to poetry collections. The guest suite where Gabriel installed me was larger than my entire apartment, complete with a private bathroom, sitting area, and access to a rooftop garden that made me feel like I was floating above my problems. Living with Gabriel felt surreal, like inhabiting a parallel universe where money could actually solve problems and powerful people used their influence for benevolent purposes. He maintained respectful boundaries while ensuring I had everything needed for pre-surgical preparation, from transportation to medical appointments to nutritional supplements recommended by the cardiac team. Our conversations during those first weeks revealed someone who was extraordinarily well-read, surprisingly down-to-earth despite his wealth, and carrying some kind of profound sadness that he kept carefully hidden behind professional confidence and genuine kindness. The second attack from my parents came in the form of a coordinated character assassination campaign designed to destroy both my reputation and Gabriel's motivations for helping me. Robert Mitchell began calling my former colleagues, college friends, and extended family members to share his version of events, claiming that his daughter had been seduced by a wealthy older man who was taking advantage of her vulnerable mental state. Martha added her own embellishments about how I'd always been rebellious and attention-seeking, suggesting that my medical crisis was probably exaggerated or even fabricated to justify my immoral living situation. The whisper campaign spread through their church community and into the broader social network where I'd grown up, creating a narrative that painted me as a fallen woman who'd chosen sexual immorality over family loyalty. Anonymous letters began appearing at Gabriel's office building, accusing him of predatory behavior and suggesting that his guardianship was a legal cover for financial or sexual exploitation. Several of my former friends called to express their concern about my situation, their voices carrying the patronizing tone of people who'd decided I was too naive to recognize my own victimization. The cruelest part of their campaign was how it twisted Gabriel's genuine kindness into something sinister and exploitative, forcing me to defend not only my own choices, but also the character of someone who was literally saving my life. When local news outlets picked up the story as a human interest piece about innovative approaches to medical guardianship, my parents provided quotes that portrayed themselves as heartbroken victims of their daughter's rebellion against family values and traditional morality. The coverage brought unwanted attention to Gabriel's business dealings and personal life, threatening the privacy he'd carefully maintained while subjecting his reputation to scrutiny based on my family's religious extremism. Despite the mounting pressure from external judgment and internal doubt, Gabriel never wavered in his support or suggested that the complications weren't worth the effort. If anything, the attacks seemed to strengthen his resolve, as if he'd expected this kind of resistance and prepared himself to withstand whatever opposition emerged. When I apologized for bringing chaos into his ordered life, he reminded me that some things were more important than convenience, and that family loyalty shouldn't require choosing between love and survival. His steady presence during this period of maximum vulnerability began building a foundation of trust that would prove essential for everything that followed. The revelation came accidentally through a photograph I discovered while searching for a book in Gabriel's study. Hidden between volumes of poetry and philosophy was a silver-framed picture of a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, with Gabriel's eyes and a smile that radiated pure joy. She was wearing a hospital gown but laughing at something outside the camera's view, her small hand clutched around a stuffed elephant while 4 lines snaked from her arm. The resemblance was unmistakable, and suddenly Gabriel's mysterious motivation for helping me began making devastating sense. When I brought the photograph to him that evening, Gabriel's composure finally cracked in a way that revealed the depth of pain he'd been carrying like a hidden wound. Emily Sterling had been his only daughter, born to Gabriel and his ex-wife Sarah during the early years of his technology company when success was just beginning to transform their lives from comfortable to extraordinary. Emily had been diagnosed with the same mitral valve prolapse that was now threatening my life, and like my parents, Gabriel had initially refused surgical intervention based on religious beliefs that prioritized divine healing over medical intervention. "I was raised in a fundamentalist household similar to yours, Sophia," Gabriel said, his voice breaking as he traced Emily's face in the photograph. "When the doctors recommended surgery, I convinced myself that faith would be sufficient, that God would reward our trust with a miraculous healing. Sarah begged me to reconsider, but I was the head of the household, the spiritual leader, and I believed that agreeing to surgery would demonstrate a lack of faith in divine providence." The irony that we'd both been victims of the same religious extremism, separated by 20 years and vastly different financial circumstances, created an emotional connection that transcended our practical arrangement. Emily had died 3 months after her diagnosis, her small body unable to compensate for a heart valve that grew progressively weaker while her parents prayed for intervention that never came. Gabriel described holding her during her final moments, watching the light fade from eyes that had trusted him completely to make the right decisions about her life and death. She never blamed me, never expressed fear or anger about the choice I'd made. She simply grew weaker until her heart couldn't sustain her anymore, and I realized that my pride had killed the most precious person in my world. The aftermath of Emily's death had destroyed Gabriel's marriage, his religious faith, and his relationship with the fundamentalist community that had supported his decision to refuse medical intervention. Sarah had filed for divorce within 6 months, unable to forgive him for choosing ideology over their daughter's survival, while their church had quietly distanced itself from a family whose tragic outcome might undermine their teachings about divine healing. Gabriel had thrown himself into business with the desperate energy of someone trying to outrun guilt, building sterling technologies into a billion-dollar empire while remaining emotionally isolated from meaningful human connections. For 15 years, I've been looking for ways to atone for that decision, Gabriel continued, his hands shaking slightly as he returned Emily's photograph to its place among his books. I've donated millions to pediatric cardiac research, funded medical scholarships, and supported families facing similar situations, but nothing could bring back the daughter I killed through ignorant pride and religious extremism. When I heard about your case through a friend at the hospital, I saw an opportunity to save the life I'd failed to protect when it mattered most. Our pre-surgical conversations took on new depth and meaning as Gabriel shared memories of Emily's personality, dreams, and the future that had been stolen by his theological certainty. She'd wanted to become a veterinarian, had collected stuffed animals from every zoo they'd visited, and possessed an innate kindness that made her popular with children and adults alike. Gabriel had been planning to take her to Paris for her 9th birthday, a trip that remained permanently booked in his travel itinerary as a monument to possibilities that would never be realized. Understanding Gabriel's motivation transformed my feelings about our arrangement from grateful confusion to genuine emotional connection. Here was someone who understood exactly what my parents were doing and why their religious convictions made them genuinely believe they were acting in my best interests. Gabriel had been Robert Mitchell 20 years ago, making the same theological calculations that prioritized spiritual purity over practical compassion, until tragedy taught him that good intentions couldn't resurrect the dead or repair relationships destroyed by ideological extremism. The third attack from my parents' religious community manifested as organized protests outside the hospital where my surgery was scheduled, complete with signs declaring that I was being corrupted by worldly medicine and that Gabriel was a predator exploiting vulnerable women. Pastor Donald Crawford, the spiritual leader who'd influenced my parents' decision, organized daily prayer vigils designed to pressure hospital administrators into reconsidering my treatment. The protesters chanted hymns, distributed literature about faith healing, and created a media circus that portrayed my medical care as a battle between Christian values and secular humanism. The protests created additional stress during an already terrifying period, forcing Gabriel to hire private security and arrange alternative entrances for my medical appointments. More disturbing was learning that Pastor Crawford had contacted other hospitals in the region, attempting to create a coordinated boycott of any facility that would perform my surgery. The campaign demonstrated how my parents' personal religious convictions had evolved into a broader ideological crusade designed to prevent not just my treatment, but to establish a precedent that would endanger other patients facing similar family opposition. When my parents arrived at the hospital with a team of lawyers on the morning of my scheduled surgery, I experienced my first genuine near defeat in this battle for survival. They'd filed an emergency injunction claiming that Gabriel had manipulated me during a vulnerable mental state, arguing that my consent to surgery wasn't legally valid due to psychological coercion. The legal challenge threatened to delay the procedure beyond my medical timeline, potentially creating a life-threatening situation where my heart could fail before the courts resolved their objections. Gabriel's attorneys worked through the night preparing counterarguments and gathering evidence of my mental competency, while I underwent additional psychological evaluations designed to prove that my decisions were informed and voluntary rather than the result of manipulation or coercion. The court proceedings felt like a trial where my fundamental right to medical care was being debated by people who'd never experienced the terror of feeling their heart struggle with every breath. As dawn approached and my surgery time grew closer, we were still waiting for a judge's decision about whether I'd be allowed to save my own life or forced to die for my parents' religious principles. The operating room felt like entering a spacecraft designed for the delicate work of preserving human life, all stainless steel surfaces and sophisticated monitoring equipment that beeped with digital precision. Dr. Marcus Thompson, the cardiac surgeon who'd been waiting for legal clearance to proceed, explained the mitral valve repair procedure one final time while nurses prepared the bypass machine that would keep me alive during the 4 hours when my heart would be temporarily stopped. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to trust strangers with scalpels and artificial devices to accomplish what my parents believed only divine intervention could achieve. Gabriel held my hand during those final conscious moments, his presence providing anchor point of human connection in the sterile medical environment where I was about to undergo the most vulnerable experience of my life. Emily will be with you during this surgery, Sophia. I truly believe that somehow her spirit has guided us to this moment where her father can help save the daughter he failed to protect 15 years ago. His words carried both blessing and burden, reminding me that my survival would honor Emily's memory while helping Gabriel find the redemption that had eluded him since her death. The anesthesia pulled me into dreamless sleep where time became meaningless and my consciousness floated in the liminal space between life and death. Hours passed like minutes while Dr. Thompson and his surgical team worked with microscopic precision to repair the valve that had been slowly killing me, using synthetic materials and human expertise to accomplish the healing that prayer had never provided. When I woke up in the cardiac intensive care unit, connected to machines that monitored every heartbeat and breath, my chest aching, but my heart finally beating with strong, steady rhythm, the first face I saw was Gabriel's, tears streaming down his cheeks as he watched his second chance at protecting someone he loved. The initial recovery period passed in a haze of pain medication, physical therapy, and gradual return of strength that had been draining away for months. Gabriel maintained constant vigil beside my bed, reading aloud from books Emily had loved while I drifted in and out of consciousness, his voice providing comfort during the disorientation that follows major surgery. Rebecca Martinez, my primary nurse, became an unexpected ally who understood family dynamics that could complicate medical recovery, having worked with patients whose relatives created additional stress during vulnerable healing periods. Mr. Sterling is one of the most dedicated guardians I've ever seen, Rebecca told me during one of my more alert moments. He's been here every day, asking detailed questions about your care and making sure you have everything needed for optimal recovery. Some families show up for visiting hours and expect to be entertained, but he's genuinely invested in your well-being rather than his own emotional needs. Her professional assessment confirmed what I'd begun to suspect about Gabriel's character, that his commitment extended beyond guilt-driven obligation to genuine care for my future happiness and independence. My parents' surprise visit during my 3rd week of recovery felt like a carefully orchestrated performance designed to appear reconciliatory while serving more manipulative purposes. Martha brought flowers and homemade cookies, speaking in the gentle tones she'd used when I was sick as a child, while Robert maintained the reserved dignity he considered appropriate for hospital settings. They claimed to have experienced a revelation about God's plan, suggesting that perhaps my surgery had been divinely guided after all, and they wanted to rebuild our relationship moving forward. Their apparent change of heart felt suspicious given the timing and theatrical nature of their presentation, but I was emotionally vulnerable enough to hope that nearly losing their daughter had genuinely transformed their priorities. Martha tearfully apologized for abandoning me during my greatest time of need, while Robert spoke about wrestling with God like Jacob and emerging with new understanding about faith and medicine. They brought gifts from church members who claimed they'd been praying for my recovery, creating an illusion that the religious community had always supported my decision to undergo surgery. The devastating betrayal emerged when Rebecca discovered recording devices hidden among the flowers and personal items my parents had brought to my hospital room. Their reconciliation visit had been an elaborate setup to capture private conversations between Gabriel and me, gathering evidence they planned to use in an expanded legal challenge to our guardianship arrangement. Every word of gratitude I'd expressed, every moment of vulnerability I'd shared with Gabriel during my recovery, had been secretly documented to support their narrative that I was being manipulated by a predatory older man. The recorded conversations were edited and taken to local media outlets, presented as evidence that Gabriel was taking advantage of a psychologically vulnerable woman who was confused about the nature of their relationship. Sound bites were stripped of context to suggest inappropriate intimacy, while my expressions of appreciation for his kindness were portrayed as evidence of Stockholm Syndrome or coercive manipulation. The story gained traction on social media and religious websites, creating a public relations nightmare that threatened Gabriel's business reputation while portraying me as either complicit in deception or too naive to recognize exploitation. The fourth attack escalated beyond personal destruction to professional sabotage when my parents filed a comprehensive lawsuit claiming Gabriel had manipulated a mentally incompetent woman into accepting unnecessary medical treatment for financial gain. They alleged that the surgery had been performed without proper informed consent, that Gabriel had isolated me from family support systems, and that our living arrangement constituted elder abuse, despite the fact that Gabriel was only 26 years older than me. The lawsuits sought financial damages, demanded nullification of the guardianship arrangement, and requested that I be placed under state supervision until my mental competency could be properly evaluated. Gabriel's business empire became collateral damage in this expanded campaign as protesters organized boycotts of Sterling Technologies products, while religious groups pressured investors and board members to distance themselves from a CEO facing abuse allegations. Stock prices fluctuated based on media coverage of our situation, forcing Gabriel to spend valuable time managing corporate crisis communications instead of focusing on my continued recovery. Several major contracts were delayed pending resolution of personal matters, demonstrating how my parents' religious extremism was threatening not just our personal relationship, but the livelihoods of thousands of Sterling Technologies employees. My second near defeat came when preliminary court hearings suggested that the judge was taking my parents' allegations seriously enough to consider temporary restrictions on Gabriel's guardianship pending further investigation. The possibility of losing Gabriel as my legal advocate while still recovering from major surgery created panic that manifested as cardiac irregularities requiring additional medication and extended hospital observation. The stress of potentially being separated from the person who'd saved my life, combined with the knowledge that my own parents were actively working to destroy my recovery, triggered anxiety attacks that threatened my physical healing process. Rebecca became my confidant and advocate during this crisis, helping me understand legal options while providing professional testimony about Gabriel's appropriate behavior throughout my hospitalization. I've worked cardiac recovery for 12 years, and I can recognize genuine care versus manipulation, she told the hospital's social services department. Mr. Sterling has consistently prioritized Sophia's medical needs over his own convenience, maintained appropriate boundaries, and demonstrated the kind of commitment that promotes healing rather than exploitation. Her professional assessment carried weight with hospital administrators who were beginning to understand the broader pattern of family conflict that was endangering my recovery. The irony that my parents were using concern for my welfare to justify actions that were genuinely threatening my health wasn't lost on anyone involved in my medical care. Dr. Thompson documented how the stress of ongoing legal battles was affecting my cardiac recovery, while hospital psychologists confirmed my mental competency and documented the manipulative tactics my parents were using to undermine my independence. Gabriel's private investigators began building a comprehensive case file that would eventually reveal the true scope of my parents' motivations, but in the meantime, We were fighting for survival on multiple fronts while I was still learning to walk upstairs without becoming breathless. The private investigation that Gabriel commissioned revealed layers of deception and financial manipulation that transformed my understanding of my parents' motivations from misguided religious conviction to calculated criminal conspiracy. Detective Maria Santos, a former federal investigator specializing in insurance fraud, discovered that Robert and Martha Mitchell had purchased a substantial life insurance policy on me just 6 months before my cardiac symptoms became severe enough to require medical attention. The timing suggested either remarkable prescience or advanced knowledge of my condition that they'd never shared with me. Further investigation revealed that Pastor Donald Crawford, the spiritual leader who'd reinforced my parents' decision to refuse medical intervention, had been involved in similar cases involving other families whose adult children had died from treatable medical conditions while their relatives collected significant insurance payouts. Vernon Walsh, the lawyer who'd filed the recent lawsuit against Gabriel, specialized in representing families who claimed religious persecution while pursuing financial settlements from hospitals and healthcare providers who'd allegedly violated their spiritual beliefs. The conspiracy extended beyond my individual case to encompass a systematic pattern of exploiting religious communities' distrust of modern medicine for financial gain. Detective Santos discovered at least 12 cases over the past 5 years where families affiliated with Pastor Crawford's extended network had refused medical treatment for adult children with treatable conditions, collected substantial insurance payouts after their deaths, and then filed civil suits claiming their religious rights had been violated by medical professionals who'd attempted to intervene. This isn't about religious conviction, Detective Santos explained during a meeting in Gabriel's penthouse. Her case files spread across his dining room table like evidence of institutional predation. These people have weaponized faith to create a profitable system where they can literally bet on their children's deaths while maintaining the moral high ground of religious persecution. Your parents took out a $200,000 policy on your life, listing themselves as beneficiaries, just weeks before your condition became critical. The insurance documentation revealed that Robert Mitchell had been monitoring my health for months before my collapse, gathering medical information and tracking symptoms that I dismissed as work-related stress or lifestyle factors. He'd contacted the insurance company multiple times to clarify payout procedures for pre-existing conditions, demonstrating advanced planning that contradicted their claims of being surprised by my diagnosis. Martha had visited my apartment several times during periods when I'd been experiencing fatigue and chest pain, ostensibly checking on my welfare, but actually documenting my declining health for insurance purposes. Most disturbing was learning that Vernon Walsh had prepared legal documents challenging my mental competency weeks before my parents filed their current lawsuit, suggesting they'd been planning to contest any attempts I might make to seek medical treatment independent of their authority. The paperwork included psychological evaluations from religious counselors who'd never met me but were prepared to testify that my decision to undergo surgery indicated mental instability and susceptibility to manipulation by secular authorities. Gabriel's financial resources enabled a comprehensive investigation that revealed the scope of this conspiracy extended to multiple states and involved dozens of families who'd been coached to refuse medical treatment while maximizing insurance coverage on vulnerable relatives. Pastor Crawford's organization operated as a clearinghouse for families seeking to profit from religiously justified medical neglect, providing legal resources, media training, and spiritual justification for decisions that prioritized financial gain over human life. The fifth and most terrifying attack came in the form of anonymous death threats delivered to both Gabriel's office and my hospital room, warning that interfering with God's plan would result in divine punishment manifested through human agents. The threatening letters included personal information about Gabriel's business schedule and my medical routine that could only have been obtained through surveillance or insider information. Detective Santos arranged for protective details after handwriting analysis linked the threats to associates of Pastor Crawford's organization who had histories of violent extremism. The security measures transformed Gabriel's penthouse into a fortress-like environment with armed guards, surveillance systems, and restricted access that reminded me how dangerous my survival had become to people whose financial plans depended on my death. Gabriel hired a team of former federal agents to provide round-the-clock protection, while Detective Santos worked with federal authorities to build a case that could dismantle the entire conspiracy network. The irony that staying alive required constant vigilance against people who claimed to be motivated by love and spiritual concern wasn't lost on anyone involved in protecting us. Rebecca, my ally from the hospital, provided crucial testimony about suspicious behaviors she'd observed from my parents during their visits, including attempts to access my medical records and questions about my prognosis that seemed more focused on timeline than treatment. She'd documented conversations where Martha had asked detailed questions about my recovery timeline and Robert had inquired about potential complications that could affect my long-term survival. Their apparent concern for my welfare contained undertones of disappointment when medical professionals provided optimistic assessments of my improving condition. Detective Santos uncovered email communications between Pastor Crawford and Vernon Walsh discussing strategies for maximizing financial recovery from families whose children survived medical crises despite religious objections to treatment. The correspondence revealed a systematic approach to exploiting both religious communities and legal systems, using spiritual authority to manipulate vulnerable families while pursuing civil litigation that could generate substantial settlements even when their primary insurance schemes failed. The investigation revealed that my parents had been receiving regular payments from Pastor Crawford's organization, ostensibly for travel expenses and legal costs associated with their religious witness, but actually functioning as advance compensation for their participation in the insurance fraud scheme. Bank records showed deposits that corresponded with their escalating opposition to my medical treatment, suggesting their spiritual convictions had been reinforced by financial incentives that increased with their level of commitment to refusing intervention. Gabriel's decision to fight this conspiracy rather than quietly settling or relocating demonstrated the kind of principled courage that had been missing from my life until he appeared as my unexpected guardian. Despite threats to his business empire and personal safety, he committed additional resources to exposing a system that was literally profiting from preventable deaths while hiding behind religious freedom protections. Emily's death taught me that some battles are worth fighting regardless of personal cost, he told me during one of our late-night conversations about the mounting evidence. If we can stop this organization from killing other people's children, then everything we've endured will have purpose beyond our personal survival. The revelation of the insurance fraud conspiracy created shock waves throughout the religious community that had previously supported my parents' decision to refuse medical intervention. When Detective Santos released carefully documented evidence to local media outlets, complete with bank records and recorded conversations, many families who'd been influenced by Pastor Crawford's teachings began questioning whether their spiritual guidance had been contaminated by financial motivations that prioritized profit over genuine faith. Rebecca Williams, a member of my parents' church whose own daughter had died from treatable leukemia 2 years earlier, came forward with testimony that devastated the religious justification for medical refusal. She discovered that Pastor Crawford had encouraged her family to refuse chemotherapy while privately collecting insurance information and legal documentation that could be used in subsequent civil litigation. Rebecca's daughter Sarah had died at age 19, convinced that her faith would heal her, while her family struggled with guilt and grief that had been unnecessarily complicated by manipulative spiritual counsel. Pastor Crawford told us that agreeing to medical treatment would demonstrate lack of faith and prevent God from demonstrating his healing power through Sarah's situation, Rebecca testified during a community meeting at the church. Now I understand that he was more interested in our insurance policy than our daughter's survival. Sarah died believing she was serving God's plan, but she was actually serving someone else's financial scheme. Her testimony carried particular weight because Rebecca had been one of the most vocal supporters of religious opposition to medical intervention, making her recantation especially powerful within the community. The community meeting became an emotional reckoning where multiple families shared stories of medical decisions they'd made under Pastor Crawford's influence, revealing a pattern of spiritual manipulation that had cost lives while generating profits for the religious leadership. Parents described children who died from diabetes, heart conditions, and cancer while their families were counseled to refuse treatment and trust in divine healing that never materialized. The collective testimony painted a picture of systematic exploitation that used religious authority to convince loving parents to make decisions that killed their children. Margaret Thompson, whose son David had died from appendicitis that could have been treated with routine surgery, broke down while describing how Pastor Crawford had convinced their family that medical intervention would interfere with God's plan for their son's spiritual development. David was only 16 when he died in agony that we could have prevented with a simple operation. Pastor Crawford told us that his suffering was purifying his soul and that surgical intervention would rob him of spiritual growth that came through trusting God completely. The unnecessary death of a teenager from a completely treatable condition demonstrated the deadly consequences of religious extremism that prioritized ideology over compassion. The emotional testimony from grieving families created a groundswell of anger and betrayal that forced church leadership to confront the possibility that their spiritual guidance had been corrupted by leaders whose motivations weren't entirely religious. Many community members began demanding accountability and transparency from religious authorities they'd trusted with life and death decisions, while others struggled with the devastating realization that their own faith had been manipulated to serve someone else's financial interests. Gabriel and I attended the community meeting as observers, witnessing the painful process of collective awakening as people struggled to reconcile their genuine religious beliefs with evidence that their spiritual leaders had been exploiting their faith for criminal purposes. The meeting felt like a religious revival in reverse, where instead of accepting new faith, people were questioning beliefs that had cost them their children's lives. Gabriel's presence provided visible proof that medical intervention could coexist with spiritual values, while my survival demonstrated that refusing treatment wasn't the only way to honor religious conviction. Pastor Crawford's attempt to maintain control over the narrative backfired spectacularly when he tried to portray the investigation as persecution by secular authorities who wanted to destroy religious freedom and family autonomy. His defensive response to mounting evidence only reinforced community suspicions that their spiritual leader was more concerned with protecting himself than acknowledging the harm his teachings had caused. When he claimed that families who'd lost children should be grateful for the spiritual growth that came through suffering, several church members walked out in disgust at his callous disregard for their grief. The community's transformation from supporting my parents' decision to questioning the entire theological framework that had justified medical refusal created a profound shift in local attitudes toward healthcare and religious authority. Families began seeking second opinions from mainstream religious leaders who could help them reconcile faith with practical compassion, while medical professionals found themselves welcomed by communities that had previously viewed them with suspicion and hostility. Dr. Harrison Webb, who'd been my family's physician for years, was invited to speak at multiple church gatherings about integrating religious beliefs with modern medicine, helping community members understand that accepting medical treatment didn't represent lack of faith, but rather responsible stewardship of the bodies God had given them. His presentation about my successful surgery and recovery provided concrete evidence that medical intervention could be viewed as an answer to prayer rather than interference with divine will. The community's evolving perspective created additional pressure on my parents, who found themselves increasingly isolated as former supporters began questioning the decisions that had nearly cost their daughter's life. Robert and Martha Mitchell went from being celebrated as examples of faithful commitment to being viewed as potential victims of manipulation who'd been convinced to prioritize ideology over parental love. Their position became increasingly untenable as evidence mounted that their spiritual convictions had been reinforced by financial incentives they'd hidden from the community. Several families approached Gabriel and me privately, expressing gratitude that our situation had exposed the corruption within their religious leadership, while apologizing for initially supporting my parents' opposition to medical treatment. These conversations revealed the genuine spiritual struggle many people experienced when confronting evidence that their faith had been weaponized against their own children's welfare. Gabriel's patient responses to their questions demonstrated how someone could maintain religious beliefs while embracing medical science, providing a model for faithful living that didn't require choosing between spirituality and survival. The community's transformation culminated in a formal vote to remove Pastor Crawford from leadership and invite outside religious authorities to review the church's teachings about medical care and family responsibilities. The decision represented a collective acknowledgement that their spiritual guidance had been corrupted by leaders whose motivations weren't entirely religious, while demonstrating their commitment to ensuring that future families wouldn't face the impossible choices that had cost so many children their lives. The federal courthouse felt like a cathedral of justice where truth would finally triumph over manipulation, its marble columns and vaulted ceilings providing appropriate grandeur for legal proceedings that could determine whether criminal conspiracy would be exposed or religious extremism would be allowed to continue operating under legal protection. Gabriel sat beside me at the plaintiff's table, his steady presence providing anchor during emotional testimony that would force me to confront my parents' betrayal in the most public forum possible. Detective Santos had spent months building a comprehensive case that demonstrated the systematic nature of the insurance fraud conspiracy, with evidence linking Pastor Crawford's organization to multiple preventable deaths and millions of dollars in fraudulent claims. Vernon Walsh, the attorney who'd orchestrated much of the legal manipulation, was facing federal charges for racketeering and conspiracy, while Pastor Crawford himself was being investigated for tax evasion and mail fraud in addition to his role in the insurance schemes. My parents entered the courtroom looking smaller and more fragile than I remembered, their faces showing the strain of months spent defending decisions that had been motivated by more than religious conviction. Martha appeared genuinely confused about how their spiritual commitment had evolved into criminal charges, while Robert maintained the defiant dignity of someone who still believed he'd been acting according to divine guidance despite mounting evidence of human manipulation. The prosecution's opening statement painted a devastating picture of systematic exploitation that used religious authority to convince loving parents to make decisions that killed their children while generating profits for corrupt spiritual leaders. Federal prosecutor Janet Morrison presented evidence of the insurance policies, the suspicious timing of medical crises, and the financial payments that had reinforced supposedly religious decisions with concrete monetary incentives. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case isn't about religious freedom or parental rights, Morrison declared, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who dedicated her career to protecting vulnerable populations from exploitation. This is about criminals who weaponized faith to convince parents to bet against their own children's lives while collecting insurance payouts when their schemes succeeded in causing preventable deaths. Vernon Walsh's defense strategy involved portraying my parents as victims of my manipulation and Gabriel's predatory behavior, arguing that their religious objections to medical treatment had been genuine until they were overwhelmed by secular pressure and sophisticated psychological coercion. His opening statement attempted to shift focus from the insurance fraud evidence to the supposedly inappropriate relationship between Gabriel and me, suggesting that our living arrangement and age difference indicated exploitation rather than legitimate guardianship. My testimony felt like performing surgery on my own heart, dissecting years of family relationships while explaining how religious manipulation had been used to justify decisions that could have cost my life. I described my parents' initial response to my diagnosis, their systematic elimination of financial support, and the devastating discovery that they'd been gambling on my death while claiming spiritual motivation for their opposition to treatment. Speaking publicly about the insurance policies and financial incentives required confronting the reality that my own parents had been willing to profit from my preventable death. The most emotionally devastating moment came when I was forced to describe the recording devices my parents had hidden in my hospital room, betraying my trust during the most vulnerable period of my recovery while gathering evidence they planned to use against the person who'd saved my life. They brought flowers and homemade cookies, speaking words of love and reconciliation, while secretly documenting every private conversation Gabriel and I shared during my healing process. I testified, my voice breaking as I remembered the hope I'd felt during their apparent change of heart. Gabriel's testimony provided powerful counterpoint to the defense's portrayal of our relationship as exploitative. His emotional description of Emily's death and his motivation for helping me demonstrating genuine commitment to redemption rather than predatory behavior. He explained his wealth, his business success, and his complete lack of need for any financial gain from our arrangement, while providing documentary evidence of the medical and legal expenses he'd covered without seeking reimbursement or establishing any claim on my future earnings. Sophia represents my opportunity to save the life I failed to protect when religious extremism convinced me to choose ideology over my daughter's survival, Gabriel testified, his voice steady despite obvious emotional pain. My relationship with her is exactly what it appears to be, a second chance for a father who learned too late that love requires action rather than just faith, and that protecting someone means providing them with tools for survival rather than reasons for martyrdom. The prosecution's presentation of financial evidence devastated any remaining credibility my parents might have maintained about their purely religious motivations. Bank records showed the insurance policy purchases, the payments from Pastor Crawford's organization, and the timing that corresponded with their escalating opposition to my medical treatment. Email communications revealed their advanced planning and coordination with other families who'd participated in similar schemes. Martha's breakdown on the witness stand provided the emotional climax that transformed the entire proceedings from legal technicality to human tragedy. Under cross-examination about the insurance policies and financial payments, she finally admitted that their opposition to my surgery hadn't been based entirely on religious conviction, but had been influenced by Pastor Crawford's assurance that my death would serve God's plan while providing financial security for their retirement years. We thought we were serving God while protecting our future, Martha sobbed, her confession echoing through the silent courtroom. Pastor Crawford convinced us that Sophia's death would be a witness to the community about the power of faith, and that the insurance money was God's provision for our faithfulness during this trial. We never meant for it to become about money, but somewhere along the way, we started planning for her death instead of praying for her healing. Robert's testimony revealed the depth of manipulation that had convinced a loving father to gamble with his daughter's life, while maintaining the illusion of spiritual commitment. He described Pastor Crawford's systematic indoctrination process, the financial incentives that had reinforced supposedly religious decisions, and the gradual transformation of parental concern into calculated financial planning. His admission that they'd begun viewing my death as inevitable and profitable demonstrated how thoroughly their natural parental instincts had been corrupted by criminal manipulation. The jury's verdict came after 3 hours of deliberation that felt like 3 years of suspended animation where my future hung in balance between justice and continued vulnerability. When the foreman announced guilty verdicts on all federal charges against Pastor Crawford and Vernon Walsh, along with lesser charges against my parents for their participation in the conspiracy, the courtroom erupted in emotional reactions from families who'd lost children to this systematic exploitation. The sentencing hearing provided opportunity for victim impact statements that gave voice to parents whose children had died unnecessarily while their families were manipulated into believing that refusing medical treatment demonstrated superior faith. Rebecca Williams spoke about her daughter Sarah's preventable death from leukemia, while Margaret Thompson described her son David's unnecessary suffering from untreated appendicitis, their testimonies providing emotional weight to legal proceedings that had sometimes felt abstract despite their life-and-death consequences. Pastor Crawford's 25-year federal sentence reflected the scope of his crimes and the number of families he'd manipulated into making decisions that cost their children's lives. Vernon Walsh received 15 years for his role in orchestrating the legal frameworks that had enabled the systematic exploitation. while my parents were sentenced to 5 years of supervised probation that required them to undergo psychological counseling and make financial restitution for their participation in the conspiracy. The legal victory felt simultaneously triumphant and hollow. Justice finally served, but unable to resurrect the children who died because their families had been convinced that love required choosing ideology over intervention. Gabriel and I left the courthouse knowing that the immediate threat to our safety had been eliminated, but carrying the weight of understanding how easily religious conviction could be corrupted into criminal conspiracy when people prioritized authority over compassion. The months following the trial felt like emerging from a long nightmare into sunlight that required gradual adjustment before I could fully appreciate its warmth and clarity. Gabriel and I threw ourselves into planning the Emily's Hope Foundation with the passionate intensity of people who'd survived trauma and wanted to transform their experience into protection for others facing similar dangers. The foundation's mission was comprehensive, providing financial assistance for families facing medical crises, education about religious manipulation tactics, and legal advocacy for patients whose treatment was being opposed by relatives claiming spiritual authority. My complete physical recovery exceeded every medical expectation, my repaired heart beating with strength and regularity that reminded me daily how close I'd come to losing everything while my parents gambled on insurance payouts. Dr. Thompson's follow-up examinations consistently showed optimal cardiac function, while my stamina and energy levels returned to better than pre-surgery condition. The irony wasn't lost on me that the medical intervention my parents had opposed as interference with God's plan had restored me to health that felt miraculous in its completeness. Gabriel's transformation was equally remarkable, his guilt over Emily's death gradually replaced by purposeful commitment to preventing other families from repeating his tragic mistakes. Working together on the foundation's development revealed depths of his character that extended far beyond the successful businessman who'd rescued me from an impossible situation. His comprehensive understanding of both religious extremism and corporate strategy made him uniquely qualified to address the intersection of faith and healthcare that had nearly cost both Emily's and my life. The Foundation's first cases came through referrals from hospital social workers who'd encountered families struggling with religious opposition to medical treatment, financial barriers to necessary procedures, and legal challenges from relatives who claimed spiritual authority over healthcare decisions. Each case required careful navigation of complex family dynamics while providing practical assistance that could mean the difference between survival and preventable death. Rebecca Martinez, my former nurse who'd become a close friend and foundation board member, brought professional expertise about family advocacy that proved essential for helping vulnerable patients navigate medical bureaucracies while maintaining dignity and autonomy. Her experience with manipulative family dynamics helped us develop protocols for identifying genuine religious concerns versus exploitation, disguised as spiritual conviction, enabling more effective intervention in cases where patients needed protection from relatives claiming to act in their best interests. The media attention surrounding our case attracted inquiries from families across the country who were dealing with similar situations, revealing that religious opposition to medical treatment was more widespread than most healthcare professionals realized. Our foundation's hotline began receiving calls from teenagers whose parents were refusing psychiatric medications, young adults being denied cancer treatment, and elderly patients whose adult children were preventing access to life-saving procedures based on claimed spiritual convictions. Detective Maria Santos joined our foundation as Director of Investigation, bringing federal law enforcement expertise that helped identify patterns of systematic exploitation while building relationships with prosecutors who could pursue criminal charges when religious manipulation crossed into fraud or abuse. Her work revealed that Pastor Crawford's organization had been part of a larger network of corrupt religious leaders who were exploiting communities across multiple states, using spiritual authority to generate profits while destroying families. My first public speech as the Foundation's spokesperson felt like performing open-heart surgery on myself while standing in front of hundreds of people who were evaluating my credibility and competence. Speaking at the National Healthcare Advocacy Conference about my experience required revisiting traumatic memories while maintaining professional composure. But the audience's response demonstrated how desperately healthcare professionals needed resources for addressing religious opposition to medical treatment. Religious conviction and medical care don't have to be incompatible, I told the conference, my voice growing stronger as I shared our foundation's mission. Faith can coexist with medicine when spiritual leaders prioritize compassion over ideology and when families understand that protecting our loved ones sometimes requires accepting help from sources we didn't expect. The God who created human intelligence and medical knowledge can work through doctors' hands just as easily as through miraculous healing. The Foundation's rapid growth exceeded our most optimistic projections as donations poured in from healthcare professionals, religious organizations that wanted to distance themselves from extremist interpretations, and families who'd lost loved ones to preventable deaths caused by misguided spiritual counsel. Within 6 months, we'd established offices in 12 states and provided assistance to over 200 families facing medical crises complicated by religious opposition. Gabriel's proposal to legally adopt me as his daughter came during a quiet evening in his penthouse, 18 months after the surgery that had saved my life and revealed the depth of corruption within my biological family. His request wasn't driven by sentimentality or attempts to replace relationships that couldn't be repaired, but rather by mutual recognition that we'd become family in the truest sense through shared trauma and collective commitment to protecting others from similar exploitation. Sophia, you've given my life purpose that I thought I'd lost forever when Emily died, Gabriel said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd learned to distinguish between obligation and genuine love. You've helped me understand that redemption isn't about undoing past mistakes, but about using those experiences to prevent future tragedies. I'd be honored if you'd allow me to be your father-in-law as well as in fact, making official the family relationship we've already created through choice rather than biology. The legal adoption process felt like claiming my independence rather than accepting new restrictions, formalizing a family structure based on mutual respect and shared values rather than biological accident and religious manipulation. Unlike my birth parents who'd viewed me as property whose life they could gamble with for financial gain, Gabriel offered partnership based on recognition of my autonomy and commitment to my long-term welfare regardless of how our relationship might evolve. Our foundation's international expansion began when we received inquiries from families in countries where religious extremism created even greater barriers to medical treatment than we'd encountered in the United States. Working with healthcare organizations worldwide revealed that the intersection of faith and medicine created universal challenges that transcended cultural boundaries, while demonstrating how education and advocacy could help families navigate these conflicts without sacrificing their children's lives. The first Emily's Hope Foundation scholarship recipients were young people who'd survived medical crises despite family opposition and wanted to pursue healthcare careers that would help other patients facing similar challenges. Watching these scholarship students graduate from medical school, nursing programs, and social work degrees felt like watching Emily's death transform into protection for countless future patients who would benefit from healthcare providers who understood both medical expertise and religious manipulation tactics. 2 years after the surgery that saved my life and exposed the conspiracy that had been designed to end it, I stood beside Emily's grave holding Gabriel's hand while we shared memories of the daughter whose death had motivated her father's commitment to preventing similar tragedies. The small headstone was simple but beautiful, engraved with Emily's name, dates, and a phrase that Gabriel had chosen to honor her memory. Her spirit lives on in every life saved. Visiting Emily's grave had become an annual ritual that reminded us both why our work mattered and how much healing we'd both experienced through our unexpected family bond. Emily would be 23 now, probably graduating from veterinary school and planning to save every animal she encountered, Gabriel said, his voice steady despite the emotions that visiting this place always triggered. I used to torture myself imagining all the experiences she'd never have because of my religious extremism, but now I think about all the children who are alive because her death taught me what love actually requires. She's saved more lives through our foundation than she could have saved as a veterinarian, and I think she would approve of how we've honored her memory. The Emily's Hope Foundation had grown into a national organization with offices in 28 states and partnerships with healthcare systems, religious organizations, and legal advocacy groups that shared our mission of protecting patients from family opposition disguised as spiritual conviction. Our hotline received over 50 calls per week from families facing medical crises complicated by religious manipulation. While our legal advocacy program had successfully intervened in hundreds of cases where patients' lives were threatened by relatives claiming spiritual authority over healthcare decisions. My role as the Foundation's executive director had evolved from personal testimony about survival to comprehensive leadership of programs that address the intersection of faith, family dynamics, and medical care. Speaking at healthcare conferences, training hospital social workers, and developing educational materials for religious communities had become my life's work in ways I'd never anticipated when Gabriel first appeared as my mysterious guardian. The professional skills I'd developed in marketing had translated perfectly to advocacy work that required clear communication about complex emotional and spiritual issues. Gabriel's transformation from guilt-ridden businessman to purposeful advocate had been equally remarkable to witness, his corporate success now serving as a foundation for philanthropic work that honored Emily's memory while preventing other fathers from making his devastating mistakes. His ability to navigate both religious communities and secular institutions made him uniquely effective at building coalitions that could address systemic problems rather than just individual crises. Our Foundation's research division had documented patterns of religious medical neglect that revealed how systematically some extremist groups were exploiting spiritual authority for financial gain, while our education programs helped mainstream religious leaders develop theological frameworks that supported both faith and medical care. The scholarly work we were supporting would eventually influence seminary curricula and denominational policies, creating long-term changes in how religious communities approached healthcare decisions. Rebecca Martinez had become our Director of Family Services, bringing nursing expertise and intuitive understanding of manipulative family dynamics to help vulnerable patients navigate medical bureaucracies while maintaining relationships with relatives who might genuinely love them despite making dangerous decisions. Her programs had helped thousands of families find ways to honor religious beliefs while accepting necessary medical treatment, proving that faith and medicine could coexist when approached with wisdom rather than extremism. Detective Maria Santos's investigation division had identified and helped prosecute 12 additional criminal organizations that were using religious authority to exploit families for financial gain, resulting in federal convictions that had dismantled networks of corruption spanning multiple states. Her work had saved an estimated 300 children from preventable deaths while recovering millions of dollars in fraudulent insurance claims, demonstrating how criminal investigation could complement advocacy work to protect vulnerable populations. The Foundation's legal victory in establishing precedent for medical advocacy had influenced healthcare policies nationwide, creating clearer guidelines for hospitals and social workers dealing with religious opposition to treatment while protecting patients' rights to make autonomous decisions about their own medical care. Our model legislation had been adopted in 15 states, providing legal frameworks that balanced religious freedom with protection from exploitation disguised as spiritual conviction. My relationship with Gabriel had deepened into genuine father-daughter love that felt more authentic than any family connection I'd experienced during my childhood. His consistent support for my independence and professional development demonstrated how healthy family relationships could enhance personal growth rather than restricting it, while his emotional healing through our work together showed how shared purpose could transform trauma into meaningful service. The most profound lesson I'd learned through this experience was that family isn't determined by biology or legal documents, but by consistent commitment to each other's welfare and growth. Gabriel had chosen to love me when my biological parents had chosen ideology over survival, demonstrating that the people who select us often become more family than those who simply share our genetics. His willingness to risk his reputation, fortune, and safety to protect me had created bonds stronger than any blood relationship. Speaking at the International Conference on Family Advocacy and Medical Ethics, I addressed an audience of healthcare professionals, religious leaders, and policymakers who were working to prevent religious extremism from endangering vulnerable patients. Sometimes the family who chooses you becomes more real than the one that birthed you, I told them, sharing the central truth I discovered through nearly losing everything. Love isn't about controlling someone's choices to match your beliefs, but about supporting their well-being even when it challenges your assumptions about faith, medicine, or family loyalty. Gabriel's announcement that we were expanding internationally to address religious medical neglect in countries where extremist interpretations created even greater barriers to healthcare felt like Emily's legacy, reaching across cultural boundaries to protect children worldwide. Our partnership with the World Health Organization would bring educational programs and advocacy resources to regions where families faced impossible choices between faith and survival, while our scholarship programs would train healthcare providers who understood both medical expertise and religious manipulation tactics. The Foundation's 10-year plan included establishing medical clinics in underserved communities, creating educational curricula for religious institutions, and developing legal advocacy programs that could protect patients from exploitation while respecting genuine religious conviction. Gabriel's vision for this expansion honored Emily's memory by ensuring that her death would ultimately save thousands of lives across multiple generations and continents. As Gabriel and I left Emily's grave that afternoon, walking hand in hand toward the car that would take us back to the Foundation offices where we'd continue planning programs to protect vulnerable families, I reflected on how completely my understanding of family, faith, and survival had been transformed. The parents who'd been willing to gamble with my life for insurance money had taught me that blood relationships without genuine love were meaningless, while Gabriel's unexpected guardianship had shown me what family could become when people chose commitment over convenience. My heart beat strong and steady in my chest, the surgical repair that my parents had opposed now pumping life through arteries that carried not just blood but purpose, hope, and determination to ensure that other families wouldn't face the choices that had nearly destroyed mine. Emily's spirit lived on in every life our foundation saved, every family educated about the difference between faith and extremism, and every child whose parents learned that love sometimes requires accepting help from unexpected sources. What began as a medical crisis that revealed the worst aspects of religious manipulation had evolved into purpose that honored both faith and reason, proving that healing could encompass more than just physical recovery. Gabriel and I had found redemption through service, family through choice rather than biology, and hope through commitment to ensuring that Emily's death and my survival would protect countless others from similar tragedies. The drive home took us through the city where I'd nearly died from a treatable condition while my parents planned to profit from my death, past the hospital where Gabriel's guardianship had saved my life, and toward the Foundation offices where our work continued transforming trauma into protection for vulnerable families. Every mile reminded me of how far we'd traveled together, not just geographically but emotionally and spiritually, creating a family bond that honored the best aspects of both faith and love. Before we end this incredible journey together, I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a situation where family expectations conflicted with your need for independence or survival? How do you balance respect for religious beliefs with practical decisions about health and safety? Share your thoughts in the comments below because your experiences might help other people facing similar challenges. If this story moved you or made you think differently about family, faith, or the power of unexpected kindness, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories about finding hope in impossible situations. Share this video with someone who might need to know that chosen family can be just as real and meaningful as biological relationships. Thank you for taking this emotional journey with Gabriel and me, And remember that sometimes the people who choose to love us become more family than those who simply share our genetics. May you find the courage to accept help when you need it and the wisdom to offer support when others are struggling. Until next time, keep your hearts open to unexpected sources of love and healing.